yesterday we spoke a little bit about each of our courses too, and I wanted to ask you what remained from our conversation. At least, are there any main points that you want to convey about how you came to this ancestral eating, epigenetics, and embracing indigenous wisdom? It's such an interesting topic.
Yeah, thank you. I gave myself some space to go back and forth with my husband, David, and he's so good at taking things out of my mind and putting them into like structure. So
Nice.
it was super helpful. Plus the conversation we had, because there's been so much inspiration, and it was really nice to see like, yes, that's how this can take form. So some of the main points I'm hoping to kind of, I have my notes here, to explore are like our connection, our inherent connection to the land and to nature, including like our food, that truly we all have. So when I even looked up what does indigenous means, it means to be of the land or to be native. And at some point we all were that. And so I'm hoping to explore then like what does it mean to get in touch with that aspect of ourselves in a way that's so central to our well-being, which is food, and exploring, what that really is about is eating food that more closely resembles that which came out of the land or from the animal itself, and in a way that's in harmony with our environment and with our bodies, and in all those kinds of ways, what kind of transformation can occur in our whole being, because our bodies, minds, and spirits are truly one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of exploring that.
It's like bringing everything into alignment.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, bringing everything into alignment, starting with one of like the most like with our bodies, which is some of our first early experiences are through the body, right? So are we giving our bodies the right fuel? And exploring also, what ways can we do that beyond just eating more whole foods, but like a greater diversity of foods, and also seasonally. So our ancestors were evolving to eat certain foods at certain times based on what was available. And that gets into like food practices, like how is it that we can be have ethical and also the kinds of harvesting practices that do create, I guess you could call it good vibrations on all levels, because we truly are not separate from the land from which we take our food. So I think exploring that indigenous wisdom that we are of the land and, what does that mean in modern society when we are in a globalized nation? Bringing in, it feels a little different than paleo. I was exploring that when we talked about that, because of a little bit more about what is our unique heritage, because we are such a big blend now. What are the unique ancestral constellations that we are? Like I have both indigenous and also Spanish blood. And I know you have a lot of Italian, which is that whole melting pot. So bringing in that celebratory aspect to getting in touch with our culture. So I think that's how this wants to kind of unfold.
Beautiful. Well, I think that that's a great foundation for understanding also that family are the first and foremost environment in which children grow, and nurturing families' developmental needs takes care, you're taking care of the physical nurturing with food and family, but natural learning relationships really cares for psychological and emotional family needs of the child, and creating environments with the right developmental nourishments that nourish the psyche, the body, the whole spirit of the child. So it's like your work and our work together, if you put it all together, you're encompassing nurturing the whole child in a certain kind of way.
That is so beautiful. I hadn't seen that. And even like putting the parallel together, especially in those early days, like the body being that you teach about in natural learning relationships, it is about like the sensorial experience too of food preparation. And that's part of, I know, what you teach about setting up that environment. That's so cool. I hadn't seen that.
Yeah. So I kind of feel like your course and our course kind of dovetail together. I mean, if one were to take them in succession, they might complement each other really well. Because a lot of times families ask, why do I have to learn about child development? And teachers even will ask me that. I mean, can I just leave it up to my teacher to do this in the school? But actually, it's not a good idea to just leave it to the school, because family is the first environment in which children take impressions of who they are, how you relate. They come to know themselves as whole and worthwhile as they are at every age of growth. And when an adult can meet a child in their way of seeing the world, we call it their field of knowing, then the child can receive us and the information we're sharing so much better, especially if we're teaching them how to care for themselves, how to care for their bodies, how to care for their nutrition. I mean, if we're feeding them foods that aren't going well with who they are and their biological makeup, then they're going to have a much more difficult time. So we talk a lot about the evolution of a child's consciousness, or the access, through access to consciousness through childhood, and we've created how to set up the environment to nurture the whole child.
Yeah, I think that's so beautiful. And so I'm somewhat familiar with your work because I read your book, Grow Together. And what I love that you said there was, in me exposing myself to your work, what it gave me was permission. Like you said, it's the family first. And there was this sense I had when I had my first daughter, like, I have no idea. There's no handbook for parenting, which is so true, but it's so scary. So my first instinct was to outsource my power, like kind of I think you're describing, why can't we leave it to the teachers? And so I did all sorts of Googling, like, what does my daughter need right now? But what your work did was it was no longer about, but what natural learning relationships did is it was no longer about having the right rules in place. It was understanding more of that fundamental like nature of what a child needs, and it gave so much room for creativity, like for self-trust, and also trusting in my daughters, like for whatever we were meeting, like for that to emerge. So I'm wondering if you could say more about how the natural learning relationships is different from the conventional way of viewing the child.
Well, that's an interesting question. So most traditional approaches to child development are looking at stage theory, and stage theory is very linear, moving in one direction. There's no cycling back. There's no comment about transitions. And there's very little comment, if any, about the spiritual nature of the child. And so this is a whole being approach to human development. And in addition to not looking at transitions or how you nurture well-being as opposed to how you fix what's wrong, which a lot of systems look at children that way. It's like, okay, what's wrong with my child? Now how do I fix it? But instead we look at what is the child's field of knowing? How can we nurture that psychologically, emotionally, and in health and well-being to bring forth what's naturally there? And the interesting thing is, again, former developmental theorists do not address the reciprocal nature of growth and development. That is, when we make the effort to nurture children's developmental needs, we oftentimes have to call upon in ourselves a new learning as well, because we didn't get it the way we know the children need it. And so we grow simultaneously with our children. And that's a reciprocal growth process that is true if you look in nature, many places in nature, but it's just not really researched in human development. And that's where my research came into play. And so knowing how raising, conscientiously making an effort to raise children in a way that meets their developmental needs and addresses their learning within their field of knowing, then we simultaneously are bathed, you might say, in that same environment, and we grow simultaneously with our children. Children change us. There's no, everybody tells me, I ask people all the time, are you the same person you were before you had children? Everybody says, oh no, I've learned so much by raising my children.
Yeah,
And
I
that's
can
what
attest.
you just said too.
Yeah. Yeah, there's two things you inspired in me. One, like that reciprocal nature. I think that's the case in the food, this ancestral eating and indigenous wisdom, and now tying in the epigenetics piece of my program is that's what epigenetics is revealing to us now as well. We impact the environment, and then the environment in turn is impacting our genes and how they express. And so that same care to like, how is it that in our food systems and the way we, again, are relating to our food, how are we supporting the environment that then in turn is going to support us and our optimal well-being too. So I love that parallel. And then I was thinking also when you said we're not the same, your rites of passage course as well. That's the other one you're teaching.
Uh-huh.
Might be a good time to describe that.
Well, I love that you bring in epigenetics, and that, you know, we're not destined to live out some kind of fateful prescription of, you know, from the time we're born until we die, but rather we constantly grow and change, and how we relate to our environment or get our needs met developmentally does activate innate capacities within us that are available but need environmental nurturing to come forward.
Yes.
And rites of passage gives children the opportunity, if we, first of all, rites of passage are ancient and have been used in civilizations throughout history. But the contribution that I feel natural learning relationships makes to that is that we can provide rites of passage at key developmental moments throughout childhood, not just say at the coming of age or 13, you know, going from childhood into the teen years or into the adult years. But each age of childhood, there are key moments where the child is open and receptive to needing their family to acknowledge growth, needing to say to the child in a certain kind of way, we celebrate your growth. We don't want to hold you back to who you were. So we're going to go through this very formal engagement to celebrate who you are becoming and give you permission to leave the old behind and become what you're growing into, with our full support, with our full love, with our full confidence in you as becoming who you are. That is a very different kind of acknowledgement than just say a birthday or you know, a graduation or something like that, where those are nice celebrations, but they aren't really saying to the child, there's a full passage, a transition being made here, and we're going to formalize it and acknowledge it in your growth. And so when we help people understand how to do that with developmental sensitivity and how to shift and change the rite of passage content in relationship to the child's field of knowing, that gives the families some groundwork to understand how to do that with children and families. And this last weekend, we were teaching at a conference, and we had teachers in the group, and they were asking questions about how to do that within a classroom. And we were talking about that a lot too.
That's beautiful. That one I'm definitely taking that course. And just reflecting, like, you know, I guess you could call them rites of passage growing up. I grew up Catholic, and so there was a baptism, a first communion, a confirmation, and then I got married. And what you said just feels totally different, because the rites of passage you're describing are designed around the child, where and what they that's it's such a different feeling to it than being taken through this dogmatic system. And so I'd love to know more, like, are you going to be in that teaching how, I guess you just said it, like how for it to not be dogmatic and to not become a rigid structure, like.
I'm familiar with the Catholic way of bringing children into their belief systems and their for lack of a better term, their mythology of, and gradually indoctrinating children into the fact that we come in with original sin and we're constantly having to confess our sins, rather than saying we come in as whole beings and we have health available to us at every age and stage of life. And when we're nurtured and cared for in relationship to our field of knowing, the innate capacities that live within us are available to us, and then we can celebrate that growth as a child moves forward and can leave the past behind. So it's a very different approach than bringing children into the church, let's say, or anything like that. We're not saying to children, this is who you are. We're saying, you have an opportunity to be who you are and be supported in that.
Yeah, thank you. It's so beautiful. I'm so excited to learn. Like
It's fun. I was looking forward to taking your course as well, because I've never really addressed or looked at food as, how did you say it in your brochure? It was a really sweet way of saying it. You said decolonization of food. Can you help me understand what that means? How is
Yeah.
food colonized?
Yeah, so I started unpacking that when I went down a rabbit hole myself of understanding my own ancestry, and then I learned I was 40% like indigenous blood and then about 40% Spanish blood. And so I was like, what does that even mean? And it all comes down to this point in history, which was when Columbus came over and was spreading his ways. And that had a lot of impacts in many ways, but in terms of food, the impact that had was it separated the natives from their ways of being, their ways of eating. Like here in the United States, for example, our Native American population literally had their land taken from them, so they were separated from the types of foods, from their culture and all those ways, and that's had impacts on their bodies and minds and spirits, of course, in many, many, many ways and can probably even be named. But that's one of the areas of, I think, co-exploration I want to have in the course or in the program, is as we start to unpack this period of time when certain belief systems were being spread and certain foods were being spread, what were the implications of that? And what are the ways to explore as we decolonize food? Like, how do we reclaim food for ourselves as individuals? What were our ancestors eating, and what are the assumptions we're making about the food we're eating? And is it really healthy for us, or is it something that we've been told because it's in the grocery store that it's good for us?
Marketing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Are we making the sovereign choice of knowing that this food is good for me and it's fuel and it is good for my genes? Or are we eating, what somebody else, marketing is a great one manifestation of that. And then I don't know that I want to go into the politics of all, but we can go into the lobbying. We'll see. We'll see what
comes up, what emerges in the course. Well, it's really interesting, the thing that you said about taking the indigenous people and ripping them off of their land and taking their land and putting them on reservations, thus separating them from their food source, when the people who came over before wouldn't have survived unless the indigenous tribes fed them. Initially, they were starving their first winter, and they depended on the good-hearted nature of the sharing of the indigenous cultures to survive. And then they colonized it. Yikes.
Yeah, I know, that's making me feel like that. One of those things that I think may emerge and will be important to just explore, because there are things that need to be addressed. Because food touches everything: social justice, environmental justice. And so those are some of those things I think we'll just naturally kind of unpack together. But
sounds like a really interesting course, and packed with good information, and leaving one with the opportunity to reconnect to what foods actually are nourishing for their particular type. Is that the
Yeah.
right, would I call it type, or would I call it gene type, or would I call it, I don't
It can't get
know.
complex. I mean, you can get your genes sequenced and understand all that, but at least here, I think more just making it a cultural exploration of and the other piece, like when you were describing rites of passage and that civilizations have been having celebrations for ages. I think it's the same with our food, and so bringing in that celebratory nature of connecting with who were your ancestors, who are your elders, what stories did you hear about the food that your grandparents ate, and a little bit more of a like that celebratory nature, because I think
Yeah,
in life too, all things can be celebrated and more joyful. And
beautiful.
yeah.
That's
Hmm.
great. Well, thank you so much for this brief conversation to get to know you a little better and to get to know your work a little better. I really appreciate it.
Find out more about upcoming courses at our website, www.transformativedynamics.org.